Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, welcome to everybody.
Welcome back. We will continue our exploration on the theme of Sanskrit with a glimpse on some amazing wonders that are found in this sacred language. And we will invite Sraddhalu to tell us more.
Yes. We will continue where we left off last time. And it was in the immersion on the first verse, the first Rik of the Rig Veda. And those of you who have not had occasion to listen to that or rather experience that, I would highly recommend that you do that to fully appreciate the whole point of this series on Sanskrit. In a sense, that experience when you enter into the identity of the verse and the language that articulates the intuitive experience, the spiritual experience even, that's where you get a glimpse of why Sanskrit is so important. And for me, in some sense, that was the culmination of my underlying objective of introducing Sanskrit in this series. Nevertheless, we have much more to share and elaborate upon. As I have mentioned before, my entry in depth is too little, insufficient. And all I can do, and that is why I have called it an exploration, is a first glimpse of what is available. For those of you who feel so drawn, I am providing links where possible or sources where you could further explore and deepen. For the rest, we will perhaps review this theme later on, if and when I am able to enter with greater depth, to my satisfaction at least. And continuing from this theme of last time and the importance of what we experienced or glimpsed in the first Rik, I want to conclude from that why the Veda is so important, as also the Sanskrit language, or rather the original Deva Bhasha, or to whatever extent one can recover it. But the Veda itself is important because in what it formulates, what it transcribes, what it transmits, what it embodies, what it expresses, in the formulation of sound, is a spiritual experience in the most natural, spontaneous, sonoral equivalence that we could call language, closest to that experience and its expression. Among all the texts that survive from the history of humanity, the Veda are the closest for this purpose. One could say perhaps that there was a prior stage of language, but nothing of it remains. There was one disciple of Sri Aurobindo, German disciple whom Sri Aurobindo named Medhananda, one who has the delight of the, I will say, spiritual power of mind. And he was an exceptional being, many ways, as were all of the early disciples of Sri Aurobindo. And he had this old connection with the Egyptian tradition, and I believe that he had conscious recall of some life there, lives perhaps. And sometimes when seeing him, one had a distinct sense of a pharaonic quality in his presence, in his aura. One of the exceptional works that he did, partially perhaps, but still, was to create a correlation between the Vedic symbols and the Egyptian hieroglyphic symbolism. You see, of course, and it's obvious in the Egyptian tradition, the sun is so central, at least in the older phase of the spiritual period of the civilization. And then later there is the decline in the occult domain, and then a lower grade of occultism and very crude, coarse black magic occultism. And then an attempt by Akhenaton to come back to the deeper, higher, spiritual, almost Vedic roots of that tradition also. And that was one of the incarnations where the mother was, I think, Queen Tea with Akhenaton, if I remember right, and so on. There have been such correlations across in the ancient past where perhaps large parts of humanity were suffused still with the more ancient cycle of human knowledge, experience, spirituality, of which we find the last remnant in the Veda. So I mentioned this to show the correlation, that there is some kind of correlation, but the whole symbolism and even the knowledge is entirely lost in the Vedic, in the Egyptian tradition. And that being said, when we review what is in the Veda, it retains its spiritual import. Unlike most of the other traditions of the world, and I don't say this, and I say this without exaggeration, unlike most of the traditions of the world where the deeper spiritual symbol and even the, what we call today, the mystical aspect of traditions or religions has been lost, forgotten, the Veda still retains it. Even though in the more conventional orthodoxy of today, where the Veda has been largely reduced to symbolism and ritual symbol, the spiritual content of it is still retained, even though reduced now to spiritual, to religious expression. It still retains within itself a self-purifying tradition, knowledge, and the root sounds of the Deva Bhasha and Sanskrit, by which it can reconstruct or recover the fullness of its spiritual roots. And that's the beauty of the Sanskrit language and its survival today. And so I'm highlighting here the importance of the Veda itself for humanity and its future. Even today, when we enter through the root sounds into the first verse of the Veda, it is able to take us back into a spiritual experience, at least a first glimpse of it, which then perhaps could deepen much more. And it is for this reason that when Sri Aurobindo started writing the Arya, he declared as one of the objectives, and there were several, one of the objectives of the Arya was to, as if, draw back the knowledge of the previous or ancient cycles of humanity, which could still be relevant for the present and future of humanity. And then he begins that process by diving into the Veda with the text that is the secret of the Veda. Parallelly, he is translating Vedic verses, taking up the verse where the Rishi, as he grows in consciousness, meets Indra, who prevents him from growing. Agastya Muni and Indra have a colloquy. I think it's called the colloquy of Agastya and Indra. And parallelly, the third thing he is doing is his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. And parallelly with that, he is writing the Life Divine, the synthesis of yoga. So the Life Divine formulates the knowledge in a more philosophical, scientific framework, the synthesis of yoga within the framework of applied psychology and spirituality. But paralleling these two, you find this secret of the Veda, the translations of passages with commentary, and with that the Isha Upanishad. Interestingly, his earlier commentary on the Isha Upanishad he had titled The Life Divine. Now he is writing The Life Divine not as Isha Upanishad, but as his writing, though you will see strong parallels and correlations between his commentary on the Isha Upanishad and the Life Divine. But you see, three of the major writings are to do with the Veda and Sanskrit, and two of them are his two of the major works, and then later on other works got added, at which at one point he was writing 6 books at a time, 1 chapter at a time, with no prior notes. He actually had informed somebody, when it's time for the next manuscripts, let me know. And then he was in his intense sadhana. When he would be reminded, oh, we need now manuscript, he would sit at his typewriter, and the mother describes how through the silent mind the knowledge would flow directly into the fingers and type out. You hardly needed any corrections. At best, some mistyping of a letter or so. When you type very fast, occasionally the letters would get stuck, but that's about it. You did not need to revise. You don't write something and say, now I want to reread, change a line, change a word, change the sequence. Typically what human beings do when constructing with the mind. I want to say this again with some pain, that when this first Rik of the Rig Veda and the commentary on it was published, the portion we read, portions from it that we read last time from Sri Aurobindo, it was put in the centenary volumes of Sri Aurobindo. There was the Secret of the Veda, there was Hymns to the Mystic Fire, and then in the supplemental edition, they threw in portions of these various manuscripts on the first Rik, edited them, merged them to create as if one independent article, and the thing was put under the title of supplement, as if it was not part of a major work. And there was a note put there, and I'm quoting exactly from what I remember. These manuscripts, obviously unrevised, are put here only for their intrinsic value. Can you imagine the stupidity and the cheek of the self-styled editors of Sri Aurobindo to make such an absolutely meaningless comment on Sri Aurobindo's writing, and the audacity to want to edit and plug in pieces to form some kind of text rather than putting it as it was. And then saying that this obviously unrevised is printed for its intrinsic value. I'm sorry for the rant, but it's important for you to understand why so much has been suppressed or held back or even prevented from reaching out to humanity. Because there is a hostile intent in preventing Sri Aurobindo's writings and knowledge to widen out. And there are individuals who are naturally instruments for that hostility, who go straight to the root where they can catch the text, the original manuscripts, sitting in the archives of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, to harm precisely, or distort, delay, damage, erase, destroy if possible. Pranabda, who was mother's personal attendant, had said it in so many words in the 1980s, that the one way they can damage Sri Aurobindo's teaching is by going to the manuscript and destroying things or harming things there. He had warned of it, and as it turned out later, the warning was not sufficiently valued, and the consequences we saw later. But can you imagine the cheek of the editor to actually declare these writings obviously unrevised, as if they're somehow less important because they're unrevised? And I'm putting this in a context because all that Sri Aurobindo wrote in the Arya was unrevised. He wrote directly on the typewriter. There was no revision. You see, all the major works of Sri Aurobindo are unrevised. Of course, when they came for reprint, he did make minor revisions. But other than that, nothing. What you see with Savitri, where he revises and changes again and again, adds lines, modifies lines, was not from revision from its poetic value. He said each time it was trying to lift the content to a still higher grade of consciousness from which it could be articulated. So it's actually interesting to see how in the revisions in Savitri, and it's a fascinating study one can do, each time he revised what changed, what got amplified, what words were modified, and the meaning it went to. There's an interesting passage of the mother. I'm digressing from our theme, but this is the only chance we get to share some of this. There's an interesting passage of the mother where she's reading from Savitri, and Huta was recording. All of these were later used in Sunil Das' music. So as she is reading, I think it was the word beautiful, she spontaneously read it as powerful. I think it was the line, "Forever love, O beautiful slave of God," and she ended up reading "Powerful slave of God." And then, obviously, it was pointed out to her, So she immediately turned within and asked Sri Aurobindo, how did this happen? And Sri Aurobindo's comment to her, which she records, was, it is a truth of the future. And you get such a profound glimpse of the nature of evolution of consciousness. That beauty here, what is beauty today, would become also power at some point. When the consciousness is sufficiently stable, when the receptive base is sufficiently strong, beauty and power would correlate, or power would express through beauty. Beauty itself would discover its innate underlying power. That is implicit, inherent to beauty is a tremendous power to make perfect, to awaken to the divine, to break through obstacles and so on. There's a profound insight of the nature of the spiritual evolution and where we are. And so there are things like that which are so fascinating when you study the nature of Sri Aurobindo's revisions in Savitri. But he never had to do that with any of his other books. They were obviously unrevised. They didn't need to be revised because they were so perfectly articulated. So why do you make that comment about this text on the Veda? And are put here for their intrinsic value. What is this intrinsic value? The cheek, the stupidity of these editors. And they were self-appointed, not appointed by the mother, by the way. Self-appointed. Some of them, as I have mentioned before, have a language, English language, which is inferior to a college level in India. But since they have taken that power and are doing whatever they think is correct, editing, correcting, sometimes changing, we have all kinds of problems which came up in various ways in the past. But this is to say that there is an underlying hostility towards anything which has to do with the Veda, or with the Sanskrit language, or with Indian tradition and culture, civilization and spirituality in particular. And the hostility comes from the leftist agenda and from the Christian conversion agenda and the Islamic conversion agendas, and generally for those who want to weaken India and subjugate India. The British started this work as part of their colonization of India, when they discovered that here was knowledge which would revitalize India or liberate India and even unify India. They had to suppress Sanskrit first, and then subsequently all the vernacular languages, bring people to English-speaking mode, etc. They partially succeeded, and where they succeeded, we see the damage. The intelligentsia of India was as if seized by the English language and by English values, and being cut off from the roots which are in Sanskrit or in the spiritual foundations of the Indian civilization. That agenda of subjugation of the Indian spirit and civilization itself continues to this day, even though India won political freedom and has gone through many governments which have changed, which were also hostile to the same agendas, with the same agendas, which you find seated in the middle of the Sri Aurobindo ashram in the archives with the same agenda and hostility. Fortunately, because of pressure from others and demands from others and a demand even for transparency, which to this day they do not provide, of what is edited, why it is edited, how, to what extent, they will refuse to provide. But because of the pressure, at least the damage has been minimized, but it is there. And as a result, as a consequence, we have suddenly 2 large volumes of Sri Aurobindo's writings on Sanskrit and the Vedic articles. And I have mentioned before how when I asked them, why don't you publish all? They said, oh, he's writing the same thing over and over again in so many different articles. We just put the best ones. That was the kind of thinking. And you will recall what I asked in response. So, but this is to say and to highlight the value, the importance, how serious it is for this knowledge, for this language, for this wealth of spiritual content that is locked within the tradition and the language itself, and in the Veda in particular, to come forward for the present and for the future of humanity, human evolution, human spirituality and its spiritual evolution. So when Sri Aurobindo is writing in the Arya, he goes back to the Veda and the earliest Upanishads, which are the Isha Upanishad, which is derived directly from the Veda, and so on. He does not look at the later Upanishads. He does not look at the later Vedanta. He goes to the original. And even there in his writings, in his commentaries, he points to something anterior to that, of which this is the last remnant surviving portion. So you get an idea here of Sri Aurobindo's own vision and sense of priority in articulating these things. It's as if he is drawing back the knowledge, experience and spirituality of the past and embedding it, enforcing, infusing it into the present humanity and the future of humanity. This is what he was doing. And at the same time he is writing in the English language to formulate the same knowledge content in a language and a vocabulary and a structure of reasoning thought relevant to the modern mind, as he said it. Even later, and if this is in the Arya 1914 to 1920, let's say, and then he stops writing the Arya, he has extensive letters. In the 1930s, mid-30s, let's say, when he retook Savitri and then lifted it to the standard and the size that it is today, as he is writing Savitri, parallelly he is writing the hymns to the mystic fire, translations of the verses to Agni from the Veda, just translating, no commentary, no elaboration like the other prior work. Almost as if he is placing Savitri and the Veda on the same platform, same level, same value. And in that sense, it has been commented, I think it was my teacher M.P. Pandit who said that Savitri is as if the Veda for the modern age, making that correlation again. With the same kind of style, force, power, but now transmitted as closely as possible within the framework of the English language. But full of symbolism which belongs to the Vedic mind. Even the language has a Vedic turn to it. In many lines one can catch that. So he's writing these two parallelly, and Mother observes how, as Sri Aurobindo was writing these hymns to the mystic fire, to Agni, Agni would appear before him and stand. Such was the power of the invocation. Such is the power of those verses if we choose today to repeat them. Literally invoking the presence of the God, the cosmic presence of the deity Agni. I remember some nearly now 30 years ago when I was interested in doing some kind of research to draw knowledge from this kind of a connection with the past and from Sri Aurobindo's writings basing on it, and had spoken of it in some context within some of the people who are in management. One of them very proudly said, but Sri Aurobindo never gave importance to these things, meaning Vedas and Sanskrit and other things. And to me it was a dichotomy, the reality of the facts versus these opinions of people who know nothing, who have not even bothered to read. Sri Aurobindo begins with his Vedic commentaries, and the last writings he does are also Savitri and the hymns to the mystic fire. And interestingly, the other thing which he wrote in that period, late 30s, is the sonnets, which are all transcriptions of spiritual experiences, many of the sonnets of that period. Again, when you read the editorial comments in the sonnets, they structure the sonnets into two groups, and they call it early sonnets and his more mature later sonnets. It is so sad. It is so sad. These people have such an arrogance. Should never have sat in that place. As if these are more mature, those are infantile in relation. Yes, okay. We ignore that and I place this only on record. My goal in these criticisms is to place on record. Because right now, there is very little that can be done other than making it into public awareness. I do hope, I do believe in future this work will have to be reviewed, and whatever damage has been introduced by such editing will have to be removed, and Sri Aurobindo's original writings as they were to be brought out in the way he intended. Just to give an example, from 1950 to 1972, There were nearly 500 corrections introduced in Savitri alone by the self-styled editors or typists or whoever it was. And many of these had to be undone in the newer edition. But these people also introduced their own corrections at that point, saying, we know what Sri Aurobindo wanted. And that was the kind of, we feel what Sri Aurobindo intended. That's the kind of phrasing I've heard from the people. Anyway, so you'll see also in the early writings, in the earlier publications, in the sonnets, often there are two words. There will be one word and then there will be a footnote with an alternate reading. Because Sri Aurobindo wrote one word, above that he would put a second word. And this is very fascinating when you look at text like this. If you go into the idea of the first word and the second word, and you can see what Sri Aurobindo is intending as something which is a compound idea which covers both words. And English language is too narrow in the verbal sense to hold that complete idea. Sanskrit would have been more appropriate perhaps. But he is trying to fit what in the intuitive or the spiritualized mind is something much more comprehensive and rich in content into a word which is too narrow and rigid, or with some kind of wrong association. So he has to put two options. And in the earlier publications, maybe up to 40 years ago, you would have the second alternate reading. In the new editions, they've removed all that. So I asked them, how do you choose? Oh, they said, we just feel whatever is right, whatever we think is better. Okay. So a lot of these things, I suppose, in the future would have to be redone with a view to a better understanding and bringing it back to Sri Aurobindo as he wrote it. Fortunately, I can say that the bulk of the interventions of these kinds are very small today, and still they exist. And the fact even that you've removed the second reading that Sri Aurobindo has retained is a kind of a loss from this perspective. But since they don't understand this, and they think from a very narrow viewpoint, they reduce everything to their grade. All this is just to give you a background of the importance of this body of the Vedic knowledge, Upanishad, especially the early Upanishads which derive from the Veda, the Sanskrit language itself, and this recovery of the root sounds and the Deva Bhasha, and with it the knowledge, experience and the intuitive force that it can transmit for the present and future of humanity and spiritual evolution. Because you have to understand the Vedic deities are actually cosmic. You could go on any planet, on any galaxy, at any time in the universe, a billion years ago or 10 billion years from now, the deities will be the same because they are cosmic deities. Perhaps some of them might have evolved in some way, but still there would be deities in the same sense, with the same operations, presiding over the evolutionary processes in exactly the same way as they are in the human. You will remember how Sri Aurobindo describes the operations of these deities within us in the formation of language itself. Agni, Vayu and Indra, if you remember. And so this knowledge is so profound, so universal, so eternal that it is worth recovering. And this will happen inevitably. It's only a question of how long it takes, for which Sri Aurobindo gave this foundation. But there was one problem. Because Sri Aurobindo wrote in English, all this knowledge has remained within that narrow domain. You see, one of the criticisms the British had for Sanskrit in India, they claimed, and wrongly, that it was the language of the elite. And so elitism is being removed by removal of Sanskrit. So for the leftists, it's a very good argument. We are getting rid of the elites. The head of Twitter came to India, spent a few days. Many NGOs being funded by Twitter and other elements of the cabal were assembled. He spoke to them, interacted with them. And then they made one mistake of publicly exposing their agenda. There was one photograph with the NGO heads where one of them held a placard saying something like, "Destroy Brahmin patriarchy." And the head of Twitter is standing next to that. You see the hatred, fear of what this represents. What is Brahmin patriarchy? Where in India do you find Brahmin patriarchy, even going back in history? The Brahmins were by definition meant to live even the poorest. Some of them had to beg for alms. They were not allowed to own wealth to maintain the purity of the purpose and focus of knowledge. It's only under later British rule that they found the Brahmins being temperamentally more suited for intelligent decisions because they were readers, they were learners. They would put them in positions of administrative power. And under Mughal rule, similarly, they were put in administration, sometimes with properties given. But before that, there was no such property. There was, in the British descriptions, Brahmin had rarely any power, except power of knowledge, which they were repositories from where they had to share with all of society. In the same way as the Kshatriyas were the repositories of power and protection of society, and the Vaishya repositories of the wealth, and the Shudra repositories of the skill and arts, the executive perfection. So society was organized broadly, let's say, in these four varnas, but nowhere is this idea of Brahmin patriarchy or domination of any kind. These were the ones who suffered the most during Islamic rule and later under British rule, and subsequently later under leftist rule that came in with Nehru and Gandhi. Most of them were driven away. Many of them were killed, butchered in the worst way. You saw exactly the same pattern in the Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge revolution. The leftists there would go house to house. Anybody they found wearing specs, they killed them instantly. Why? Because someone who wears specs can read books. If he can read books, he has knowledge. If he has knowledge, he can awaken others, and you have to kill them. You can't afford to have knowledge if you want to keep this imposition of the leftist or other ideologies, to keep people enslaved. And it was the same mentality with the Mughal invasions and the British invasions, and subsequently the leftists in India. So many of the Brahmins were practically driven away from India, went to the US and became the focal point of Silicon Valley, and the whole software revolution was created by them. Many of them won't come back because they're too rooted there now. But the point here is, there is no such thing as Brahmin patriarchy that needs to be destroyed. But why do they do that? These are the bugbears. And what is it centering on? The holders of the knowledge. What do you associate with the Brahmins? Well, they have the knowledge of the traditions and the lineage and the spiritual content and the dedication to protect it and even to die for it. It's like killing people who wear specs in the Khmer Rouge. And that agenda is still on. I'm sorry I'm digressing a little bit, but it is to put in context the importance of this knowledge and what a battle it is to protect it from being destroyed. So when Sri Aurobindo presents all this, it is written in the English language. But in India, there was already this split among the traditionalists who had been brought up in the traditional way with the base of Sanskrit, living in Sanskrit, thinking in Sanskrit, and those who grew up in the Anglicized, Europeanized mind. And there were two mindsets, two linguistic bases, two often contrary cultural values, and a collision of two worlds. Who would convey from one side to the other or bridge that gap? While Sri Aurobindo, writing in English, awakened the English-speaking reading to whatever he had to convey, those who were within the domain of the traditional sphere, who don't have the same familiarity with the English language, were resistant, because anything coming in English, there was a resistance. Today, interestingly, most of the Brahmin traditionalists also have English language access. Many are losing roots while swinging from one side to the other. Some kind of bridge is forming artificially, though. It was at that time that something extraordinary happened. One of Sri Aurobindo's premier disciples was T.V. Kapali Shastriyar. He was teacher of my teacher, M.P. Pandit. His history, we will have perhaps another occasion in the future to speak a little bit about him more completely. But he had already been initiated into the Sri Vidya tradition, worship of the Divine Mother. From his young age, I think from the age of 5, by the age of 10, he had read the Mahabharata several times. He was deep into sadhana. He came under the influence of Ganapati Muni, who then brought him to Ramana Maharshi. And he writes how, through all that, when he had the knowledge in Sanskrit, he had grown up with Sanskrit, understanding as it was taught, the Vedas as it was understood, and he had glimpses which felt that there was something more to it. Under Ganapati Muni, he had the deeper insight of the deities and what they were as cosmic powers, as well as their individualized functionings, etc. That way had opened to him. And what Sri Aurobindo later developed in great detail, he had already initially got a glimpse of from Ganapati Muni's own discoveries. And completely independent, he says. 1916, he came across Sri Aurobindo's writings from the Arya, and particularly these writings, and suddenly he discovers this wealth. And every night he would reread the entire Arya again and again and again, every night until the new edition, the new journal, the next journal would come out. Think about a man who has been in intense traditional knowledge, tapasya, spiritual foundations. When he reads this, he says, wow, this is so extraordinary. And he cannot contain himself, he has to reread because there is so much depth of knowledge. Compare that with the modern mind. So shallow, so superficial. We read once, yes, I have understood, close the book, forget it. I read it 20 years ago, 30 years ago. When you actually read it and you realize that you've caught a little bit and your mind is rich and deep enough, you realize you've caught just a little bit, you reread and you go deeper, and you reread and you go deeper, especially for texts like this which are not informational, but spiritual, experiential in content. Such was the method used in the Vedic tradition and in the Upanishads. By rereading, by dwelling, you drew out the deeper knowledge which was implicit. And because he had that training, now he could have access to this. And what is fascinating about him is that his mastery of the English language is so brilliant, and Tamil and Telugu. And when he writes in English, you would say it is of such a high standard, one would say almost approaching Sri Aurobindo in his style and lucidity, clarity, precision, with the same force of the mantra, because it came from his tapasya. So here's a man who comes rooted from that tradition, bridges with the English language, and now discovers in Sri Aurobindo what he has been seeking all his life. And there was a point of transition where he came to Sri Aurobindo, he meets Sri Aurobindo, he describes his first experience of meeting him. As he was climbing up the stairs, approaching Sri Aurobindo's room from a distance of 20 meters, he said all his chakras began to open spontaneously in the approach of the physical approach to Sri Aurobindo. And he says, such an extraordinary being that you approach him and all the centers open. But he could experience that because of the parayar sadhana he had done. So such a man now, he comes to the Sri Aurobindo ashram. He was with Ramana Maharshi, and Ramana Maharshi shed a tear when Kapali Shastri chose to come to the Sri Aurobindo ashram. And he said that there was just a thin veil between the two. Had he stayed longer, he would have merged completely in the oneness with Maharshi. I'm sharing these to give you a glimpse of what he was. Having come to Sri Aurobindo ashram, Shastriya describes how in 6 months, by the action of the divine Shakti, the divine mother, 10 years of work was achieved with ease. And many other experiences he narrates. All of this led to a point where, incidentally, when Ramana Maharshi's orally transmitted writings were to be translated, he asked specifically for Shastriya's help, and with Sri Aurobindo's permission, Kapali Shastri went there, completed the translation and came back. But subsequently, there came this point where all the work that Sri Aurobindo had done regarding the Veda, Kapali Shastri was impelled by circumstances here, he says, by people here, to explain the verses, to translate them. And there's a point where he wrote to Sri Aurobindo and asked his permission to develop this, with a special request that he would write this only if Sri Aurobindo accepted to verify personally all that he wrote. Sri Aurobindo agreed. And then for several years, Kapali Shastriya wrote, addressing to the traditional Sanskrit scholar and Vedic scholar. So in Sanskrit he wrote, what is Sri Aurobindo's approach in the interpretation of the Veda? He elaborated on the root sounds, meaning, demonstrated logically how the current understanding, based largely on Sayana and others, was internally inconsistent and even sometimes obviously wrong, and how this approach actually healed those issues and made something more comprehensive and evoked most directly the spiritual content of the Veda. So he wrote first this elaborate commentary along with the translations of the verses. Each of these in bits was sent to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo corrected at times, but at every stage with correction, with his approval, that was accepted and then eventually published. It was A.B. Purani who would read out what Shastriya had written in Sanskrit. Sri Aurobindo would hear and make observations, comments. And so sometimes when Purani would jot down what Sri Aurobindo had said, sometimes there was an elaboration which Purani acquired, based on which he wrote his commentary on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Veda. And all that was triggered by these articles. And finally, by the time Sri Aurobindo left his body, quite a large portion of the work was done. But after Sri Aurobindo left his body, Kapali Shastriya could have continued, but it was his view that it would not have the same authenticity. And for that reason, he stopped. But what he did was done following the lead and the indications of Sri Aurobindo. I believe, though, that many of the texts of Sri Aurobindo which are now published were not available then, had not been published then. So quite a large body of the etymology and some of the things we have referred to particularly had not been published. He did not have access to that. It was only the published portions from the Arya, and whatever was in print then was the base from which he derived. But still, that was enough to give him the necessary hints, and he worked upon this. This work which he did was then sent out to many of the scholars, Vedic scholars of the time. And he writes, Shastriya writes, that the feedback he received was everywhere consistent, positive, supportive, saying this is extraordinary. Can this application actually work for the entirety of the Veda? They were keen to know. So this is an exceptional work which was done, bridging these two worlds, so to say, by the only person who had the competence and the spiritual foundations, and with the sanction and verification of Sri Aurobindo, which nobody today can have, unfortunately. But still, that work was done. This is so important. It is now part of Kapali Shastriya's collected works, spread across the volumes themselves go into 10 volumes and index, but the collected works of them, at least 4 volumes are related to this. The commentary, the translation, and upon that later my teacher M.P. Pandit, with Shastriya's permission, made his first attempt to translate from the Sanskrit to English. So you see how it works? Bridging through the Sanskrit language, we needed that value to be brought within the English domain, which my teacher did, and Shastriya corrected his early writings of the translation. That was not completed, the bulk of it was completed later, and is now part of the collected works of Kapali Shastriya. So all this is to just give you a background of something so important, whose value you will appreciate today after all that we have explored of the Vedic content based on the root sounds and the deeper understanding of Sanskrit itself. But our exploration doesn't stop here. We have something else which is equally important to share, and this is again coming from the person that I have been referring to quite frequently recently, Dr. Sampadananda Mishra, and this is a book titled The Wonder That is Sanskrit, and author are Sampad and Vijay, but actually the entire book is written, including the introduction, is written by Sampadananda Mishra, which is an extraordinary work. There is at present in the English language no such text anywhere. Even in Sanskrit you will not find a text like this which assembles so many important rich content in one place. Particularly in the first part of the book, where Sampadananda has drawn from various different disparate texts across the rich body of Sanskrit literature. Now here again I make an aside. Remember what the British said, and the leftists have caught on to, that, oh, Sanskrit is the language of the elite. And therefore, in destroying Sanskrit, we are destroying elitism. And that's why we drifted off into that example with the Twitter head funding this destruction of the traditions. But this equally applies to the English language in India. In India, the people who speak English, read fluently in English or write fluently in English are an elite, which in percentage number is lower today than it was when Sanskrit was commonly used under British rule. So the elitism has not gone away, it has just been colonized, if at all it was elitism. The reality is that it was not an elitism. The Sanskrit language itself was the link language. As in Europe, Latin was for a quite large time, especially under Roman rule, it was the link language because it was at the root of many of the European languages. But in India, it was even more obvious. Every language recognized consciously that it was derived from Sanskrit. To this day, 70% of all the words of all Indian languages are directly from their Sanskrit origin, including Tamil, by the way. Despite some of the political Tamilians who want to declare Tamil as a separate language and separating Aryan and Dravidian, which was part of the British mischief to divide India. And this was one of the points Aurobindo makes. When he saw that Tamil language was 70% Sanskrit, he asked himself, well, how does this happen? And started his inquiry into that. But all this is to say that Sanskrit today is not an elite language, nor was it ever an elite language. It was the linking, unifying language. It was the universalizing language. It was a language that linked into the entire body of civilizational knowledge, experience, history, culture, science, literature, philosophy, yoga. By cutting off Sanskrit, you cut off all this and reduce the average Indian to a bad, poor replica of the British, or at least attempted to. You couldn't, because there was still the vernacular. As long as that was there, indirectly much of this came through. But then removal of Sanskrit allowed you to divide people along vernaculars. So the British had cricket matches between people of different languages, and then they would pit them against each other on the basis of language as a way of dividing. A lot of powerful psychological tools were used. But the moment you bring back Sanskrit as the underlying language, instantly all these divisions dissolve. So you can see the importance of Sanskrit for the future of India, but through that for the recovery of the body of knowledge, because as long as Sanskrit text you are blind to, you are dumb with, you lose everything. With that, everything comes back. And so every attempt to bring back Sanskrit has also been opposed. Unlike you see the example of Israel, where from the sense of pride in their innate civilization, which was held because it was a small group under oppression much of the time, they held together. So when they founded Israel, they recovered their Hebrew tradition, made it a living language again, where it had largely faded as one of the ancient languages. The same thing today, if we were to recover Sanskrit, it would come back with the same, perhaps greater force, but it would unify India and bring back the full force of the spiritual, civilizational power that they fear. Those who want India to be suppressed, subdued and enslaved, they fear this. And it is the key which could make this happen so rapidly. And therefore, everything can be done that they do to suppress. Now, all this is to prepare you for the content of the book itself, because what Sampadanand has done, he has gone through across various traditions, lineages, writings, books. It's a huge survey, and drawn out gems from various, assembled them in chapter-wise structure to demonstrate the special features of the Sanskrit language and the special kind of content available in the Sanskrit language. So I'm going to touch upon this again. I will highly recommend for those who are interested to read the book. I've put the links from where you can buy. I've put 3 links in fact. And you will see here, first chapter deals with the Sanskrit grammar structure itself and the nature of the vowels, consonants, relationships, how they join to each other, and then the nature of the root sounds and the structure of grammar, as we have seen the Panini's grammar rules and so on. It gets somewhat technical, but with amazing elaboration and examples. The nature of the sound in the language, the nature of the sutras, different kinds of sutras, and how knowledge has been contained or compressed in various ways. But the next chapter, which is called Interesting and Amazing Creations in Sanskrit, is what I'm going to elaborate upon a little bit today. He shows how the flexibility inherent to the language can be used to compose things which are so extraordinary as to be impossible in any other language of humanity. But not only that, the language is flexible enough that it can be pushed to this degree, it also shows you the genius of the mind which formulated these amazing creations. So, here's an example, and I'm reading at random just from one of these pages, page 36. He says, here's a shloka, a verse, which uses only 3 consonants. The, va and na. So just combinations, the, va, na. So it goes, Devanam, Nandano, Devo, Nodano, Veda Nindi Nam. The, va and na. With vowels. And there's a meaning. Fascinating. Another shloka which uses only 2 consonants. In this case it is bha and ra. Bhuribhir, bharabhir, bhirabhu, bhariri, bharira, bhire, bhire. What does that mean? I'll just read out the meaning. The fearless elephant who was like a burden to the earth because of its heavy weight, whose sound was like a kettle drum, who was like a dark cloud, attacked the enemy elephant. There's a second verse also. Now imagine a language where you can play with just 2 consonants and throw in vowels, variations in between, with rhyme, rhythm, meaning. Isn't that amazing? Well, that's not it yet, because he pushes the boundary of the examples. There's one entire shloka using a single consonant. One single consonant. How is that possible? Okay, so I read here. This is na. Na, nona, nunno, nunneno, nana, na, nana, na, nana, nanu. If you actually break up, because these are joined, if you break them up, it is actually rationally, logically, very clean, pure Sanskrit. And with the meaning, a man is not a man who is wounded by a low man. Similarly, he is also not a man who wounds a low man. You see the play on by whom, na, na, ne. So you use, obviously you had to bring it to an domain of idea where you could use similar sounding words with certain ideas which are then repeated multiple times to build this. So wounding, man, low, so all those key words are used. And there's another one which uses the. Da, the, do, the, do, da, di, da, the, do, the, di, dam, do. First round, a second verse, second line is there. I'm just translating. Shri Krishna, the giver of every boon, the scourge of the evil-minded, the purifier, the one whose arms can annihilate the wicked, etc. See, the is the giving. So boons, giving. You get the idea of the sound itself. But think about it. Now, if you go back to what we discussed and the examples we saw in the roots that Sri Aurobindo described, you can get a sense of how this is possible, because the, remember, can move to the, da, di, du, dr. And all these variations would have a different sense of meaning. You could pick words derived from these and then combine them to build something, because it's roots based. Amazing. And then he gives another example of a shloka where each quarter is written with 1 consonant. So each line. First line is with the j, second line with the, third line with bh, fourth with the r. I don't read, but you should enjoy. When you buy the book, or if you download it, if you find a copy somewhere, and you find the Sanskrit script, you'll say, I cannot read that, I can't appreciate the sound. Fear not, you just go to the back. There is actually here a transliteration of all the shlokas, chapter wise, with the number of the shlokas. This is unfortunately a bad design by the editors. They should have put the transliteration right there just next to the Sanskrit. So someone who cannot read Sanskrit would still catch with transliteration. That should have been the structure, but anyway, this is done. So hopefully in the next edition, if they ever bring that out, it could be done in this way. Now, I have given a few examples, but this is nothing compared to what is to arrive still. There are many more extraordinary examples. Here, for example, he gives one where the vowels are restricted. So you can change consonants, but vowels are stuck. So I give an example with the E. So, kshiti, sthiti, miti, kshipti, vidhi, vinni, dhisi, dhilit. Second verse I don't read. O Lord Shiva, possessor of the three eyes, the knower of existence, measurer and destroyer of the earth, etc., etc. See the way you can play with the sounds. And similarly, he gives examples of shloka with the U. Now here's one of the most amazing. He says, there's a shloka of 32 syllables using only one consonant and one vowel in the entire verse. Now this is mind-blowing. How is it even possible? I'm just reading it out, and when I read it, it will not make sense to you. But if you break the sounds, words correctly, you will find it makes eminent sense, and Sampadanand gives you the breakup also. So the verse goes, I'm reading only the first line. The second you can guess by repeating it in your head. And it goes, ya 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 ya. Wasn't that interesting? And what does it mean? Just the first line. The sandals which adorn the Lord, which help in attainment of all that is good and auspicious, which give knowledge, which cause the desire of owning the Lord, which remove all that is hostile, etc., etc. Yeah, by whom, of whom. You see the ya sound and then how it plays, and he gives the breakup of the way the yas are done. So it is just an example of the flexibility. Of course, you can't do this with just anything and any sound, or it would require a tremendous effort to force fit perhaps, but that it could be done so easily that someone could discover this and actually sought to create a verse of this kind. That shows you the genius of the mind, but also the flexibility and power of the language. There are many more things. There are a whole category of variations, what are called palindromes in English, where you have the same text going forward and the same text going backward. But in the English language, if you went forward and you went backward, it would mean the same thing. In Sanskrit, of course, you can do that, but you can also do something else. You can have Sanskrit, one word going forward has one meaning, you go backward, now it's a different verse, but it has a different meaning. So one way would be prayer to Vishnu, one way would be prayer to Shiva, I have mentioned before. And you reduce each sound to its numerical equivalent using the Katapayadi system, which we spoke of, and you get pi to so many decimal places. And things like that, which are possible. So palindrome, I skip. What is more amazing is that there are variations within the palindrome which are almost mind-blowing. I want to give another example. Perhaps in the book, I don't know where, but I've heard from Sampadanand in other context. Among the Jains, for example, although a very ascetic tradition, the power of many of these ascetic traditions was the brilliance of the intellect. So there were these Jainas who were masters of Sanskrit. They were monks. They were trying to turn their whole mind to the divine, but with using the power of reason to construct things which would liberate from the limits of mind itself. Okay, so they would play with many of these things. So one of the texts, I'm told, is where the entire text you can read is the story of one of the Jain saints. You take the same text and you break it up in a different way and you get the story of another Jain saint. Interesting. And this is possible because of the nature of the language. And I believe there was one, I don't know the context but there were multiple meanings all in the same one paragraph. Then there's something else, Chitra Bandhas, where the shloka forms patterns in the letters. And when the letters are put together in a certain sequence, it forms as if the shape of a drum, and the weaving pattern of letters. So if you take a verse and then you weave the letters across the verse in a particular way, you get another verse, different meaning, and so on. So there are many interesting things you can do with such things. Then you have patterns where verses, when they are laid out square, you go forward, you go backward, you go up, down, and they are all complete verses in themselves. Again, that shows an extraordinary genius of mind. And then comes the most amazing, which is a blending of intellectual brilliance and poetic composition with mathematics. So there's a famous example in European history where mathematics, as you know, really took its birth when the mathematics from India went to Europe. Until then, the church had suppressed all knowledge. They wanted people to remain dull, stupid, dependent on the church, and only their priests could have some knowledge within the boundaries of what the church permitted. So, many mathematicians in Europe would argue that the Roman numeral system was terrible for mathematics. The moment you went more than 100 or 200, there was no way to manage numbers. And only the best of their intellectual priests could do some manipulation of numbers, because the representation itself was disharmonious with the concept of number itself. So the Hindu number system, they already knew of, the mathematicians, and they wanted that to come forward, because with that the calculations become so much simpler with the concept of zero and everything else. But also with that came the knowledge and tradition of the mathematics from India. Now, this is again outside the scope, it's not within this book, but Sampananand has given a lot of things with mathematics also. But I want to give a few examples. There's something called Diophantine equations, which are some of the most complex and advanced mathematics. And we have Bodhayana doing Diophantine equations in India at least several hundred years before the European mathematicians. We have Indian mathematicians doing integral calculus and differential calculus at least several hundreds of years before Newton. So there's even the suggestion that these concepts were transferred from India. We don't have always evidence for all of these, but some of these we do have evidence. And so what we do find, and through that evidence, is when finally the mathematicians won over the church, they overthrew the church from the domain of maths. They seized the domain of maths with the Indian numeral system. With it came the Indian mathematical knowledge also. That triggered the whole awakening of mathematics in Europe. And one of the great mathematicians, and he was brilliant to this day, his name is, they write Euler, E-U-L-E-R, pronounced Euler in English for whatever reason. So Euler proposed this problem. You know the chessboard, if you put the horse on one corner and make it moves 2 steps forward, 1 step to the side. So if you make the horse jump all over the chessboard, can you cover all the squares without ever repeating any? This was a huge problem. It took, I think Euler solved it perhaps. It took about 300 years of struggle to solve it. Now we come to a Sanskrit verse. The verse is written here. Okay, and maybe I can read the meaning. Sthita samaya rajat pagatara madake gai. And second verse. The sandals which protect those who shine by their right attitude, whose place is in the center of the blissful rays, etc. That's the translation. If you saw the verse, you would say, another religious verse. You know, when you go to the hieroglyphs in Egypt, when they don't make sense, they will say religious hieroglyph. Doesn't make sense, right? So you'll find lots in India, a religious prayer. Most of the Vedas, religious, ritual. No, it's not. It's profound scientific, sometimes technical knowledge also. So here's verse which you would have just thrown away as religious, except when you write it out on the chessboard, 8 by 8 squares. And now you put your horse on the corner and start jumping according to the number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. You'll see the dotted line here. You have the solution to the problem of the horse jumping all over the board, never repeating any square once. And as it jumps, you repeat the verses. So you have the Sthita, Sama, etc. You read the letters. Oh, I'm sorry. What I read was what happens when you read it in the sequence. So as you jump the horse, you read the verse and you get another poem. And what I read was that. What is the original poem? Again, O sacred sandals of the Brahman, you are always adored by those who have committed unpardonable sins, etc. That when you jump around with the correct solution to the horse problem, you get the sandals which protect those who shine by their right attitude, etc. So here is a poetry composed with rhyme and rhythm which actually solves that problem of the horse, and in the movement of the horse gives you a second verse that emerges out of the first. Imagine the intellectual brilliance of the person who composes this. Isn't that extraordinary? It's a 10th century manuscript, a saint who lived 800 years before Euler. Tamil saint Sri Desikan. Amazing. Why isn't this part of the Indian textbooks? Not just this, all such examples, and there's so much more, including engineering feats of all kinds across the temples, across the palaces all over India, across so many other things. Why shouldn't this be, in fact, the point of reference for a review of the civilizational ideals, aspirations, achievements to inspire the next generation? It's not there because the British removed it. After India won her freedom, it's not there because Nehru, Gandhi and the leftists prevented its return to keep the mind enslaved, to cut off from the roots of the civilizational values. Any other civilization in the world, if it had achievements of this kind, would be presenting these to the young children from the beginning, making them learn by heart these verses and play with the outcome of it, if nothing else, isn't it? Rather than teaching, even today in India, stupid verses from England, 3 men in a tub, rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, butcher, baker, candlestick maker. What are you talking about? And our exam questions to this day will ask questions like, how many wives does King Henry VIII have? Name them. That's your exam question for history of England in free India. Do you see the stupidity of the whole educational system and its attempt to numb the minds of the young and cause dislike, hatred, disdain, disgust for their own past and traditions? If you knew that these were written by the Brahmins of that time, you would say, the Brahmins are the epitome of the keepers of knowledge. They are some of the greatest creators of these skillful works, as the sculptor of the Shudra is the creator of the perfect work of painting or sculpture. Or the Kshatriya is the creator of the valor and the selfless courage and strength and other activities. Organization of the military might or organization of structure of administration, all of these would come under them. But this is created by the very people that Twitter head wants to kill and destroy. And instead our children grow up with disdain for Sanskrit and for the past. Those are old things. Here is the modern. Look at the modern and you look at everything from the West as superior somehow. Because they don't know. They were never told. Because their teachers didn't know. Because their teachers' teachers didn't know. Because it was all suppressed 100 years ago. And this is just a drop. Sampadananda has gathered from all over some of these gems, but there is so much more. If he took the trouble, it would have perhaps gone on to be too big. And then there are all kinds of other examples he gives of verses. There's a whole chapter on the Sanskrit in arts, the sciences, and daily life. So, since the intention at that point was to share something of the glimpse of the language and the content in the language. Another chapter on the beauty and charm of Sanskrit poetry, where he draws from various famous poetry verses, and then the spiritual content that is held in the language, and the nature of the link to the language to the India's soul, and the question of whether India can recover and Sanskrit as the national language. All those issues are dealt with subsequently. But you see here a first glimpse of the extraordinary features, and what I have called here is this amazing wonders, title being The Wonder That is Sanskrit. And when Sampadananda published this, it shook the whole English space. To this day, people draw not only on the title but also on the content from these books, without referring to the book, without saying, "Oh, it's from him." It's like, "Oh, we just discovered," or "This is things we already knew." No, they didn't, because the anglicized Sanskrit scholars do not know these things today. It needed someone who bridged the two worlds. And so Sampadananda interestingly comes from that background, from a traditional Sanskrit background, but also then bridging and crossing over, and with the help that Sri Aurobindo gives of the root sounds, what he has been able to do is actually quite outstanding. And I'm sure there is much more that will happen subsequently. So as a part of what we had also mentioned earlier, we have invited Sampadananda to join us next Saturday. And some of the questions that have been placed by many of you, I have also kept aside to place before him. But also at that time we'll have a much more live interaction with questions in the chat box. If you want to send in advance, that's also fine. But my purpose today was to bring somewhat to closure this part of the discussion with the Sanskrit language itself. We have had a glimpse of the nature of the language from its root sounds, the nature of the content that is in the Veda particularly. Of course, the knowledge in the Upanishads we gain from reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Isha Upanishad, for example. And today we had a glimpse of the flexibility and power with which the language can articulate things or even express. There was one last example. Actually, there are two more things Sampadananda has done which are beyond this book. One is he has an entire book on the rhythms, the meters in Sanskrit poetry. And the meters, interestingly, in India are cosmic rhythms. And they have often names which indicate what they correspond to in the cosmos. So he has an entire book on that with examples of that. And a master in Indian poetry was one who would compose spontaneously in those meters with profound insight. And one such, if we have to recall, is Ganapati Muni, of whom I spoke earlier, who actually discovered Ramana Maharshi and named him Ramana Maharshi. Otherwise, he was just called Ramana or various other names. So, Ganapati Muni at one point wrote out 1,000 names of the Divine Mother as Uma Sahasram. Sometimes an entire verse would be extolling one aspect of the Divine Mother, one name. Sometimes there are several names in a single verse, and so on. But he had made up, in those days that was the style of the masters, he took an oath, by such and such day I will complete. So as he started doing, it was not flowing at the pace he required. It was not happening at all, and more than half remained, and it was already evening. Next morning would be the end, and he would have lost his the oath that he had taken. So he goes to Ramana Maharshi and tells him, "Master, I need help. I cannot have, about half is left." So Ramana Maharshi asks him to sit down. There are two people who are writing, and he goes into deep trance, and Ganapati Muni starts chanting. Verse after verse, just flowing. And why I'm saying this now is because every 20 or 25 verses, he changes the rhythm. Completely rhyme, rhythm are different in a different style, and the content just acquires a different character of the flow. And every now and then he shifts to another. Imagine the mastery that a poet has to have to be able to chant spontaneously, extempore, a verse with rhyme and rhythm, and then switch meter and hold that meter for so many verses, and then switch meter and hold that for so many, and go on for 1,000 verses. It is simply mind-blowing. The genius of these people. And these were considered to be normal geniuses, and we look to even more exceptional geniuses, isn't it? The modern mind, through the modern education, is so crude, so blunt, so weak, so fickle, so shallow, so dispersed compared to these. And this man is barely, 80 years ago. So, I can finish the story. He's chanting and it's flowing, and the people are struggling to keep up as he's dictating. And he completes the whole thing through the night, finishes 1,000 names of the Divine Mother, and when it's over, before daybreak, when it's over, Ramana Maharshi opens his eyes from trance and then says, "Has all that I have said been taken down?" He was literally transmitting the whole thing. And Ganapati Muni tells him in so many words that we received all that was given to. He is also conscious of the source of this inspiration. And this is to give you a glimpse of how this whole field of poetry was a domain of spiritual inspiration. It was a means of consciousness growth, but also of consciousness articulation from a higher consciousness into the world of form and sound and power of rhythm and verse and spiritual experience. Without that, it was not composition arbitrarily. That is why you find some of these greatest creations, even in those verses, coming from saints. Mathematical creation of the horse is coming from a saint who's singing a verse which is a prayer to the divine. And so spirituality in India was not something cut off from life. It was literally empowering life with means which were extraordinary outside the domain of life. And the language which could make that bridge from the spiritual experience to the formulation was Sanskrit. And that's why it was sacred language. Even for the spiritual, for the saints, all the saints of India, irrespective of what region they were, irrespective of their local dialects or languages, knew Sanskrit, composed in Sanskrit, for the most part, with variations, exceptions, but at least they knew Sanskrit. So you get a glimpse even in that of the way the rhythms flowed and the mastery one had to have of the rhythms. And it's only recently that about now 25 years ago that we finally got the complete works of Ganapati Muni, whatever survives of his writings. Finally, it was one of his premier disciples who had the last works. While he was alive, I approached him and I requested him. I said, please, let's just put this while you're alive, you personally edit. He said, no, I will not give to anyone because nobody knows them like I do. I said, great. Please, you do it. You oversee it. We'll get you the people. And interestingly, Sampadananda Mishra was one of those. In fact, he was the main person who did the whole work of the transcription of the Sanskrit, copying, putting it together, structuring, proofreading, and under notation's guidance, and then notation passed on soon after completing this. So this is one of those things which we have fortunately been able to preserve. Among them, by the way, he had also written what Ganapati Muni considered to be a template for the Constitution of India, written in Sanskrit, but on spiritual foundations. So what would be the spiritual framework for a Constitution of India? Interesting. None of these were even considered by the English-bred intelligentsia. Even today. Not only they cannot consider, they cannot read because they've been cut off from their roots. So consider the importance of bringing back the Sanskrit language. And so I'm going to complete with the mother's observations about this. And of this, both Sri Aurobindo and mother have spoken quite openly. And about Sri Aurobindo says this: the vital question is how we are to learn and make use of Sanskrit and the indigenous languages so as to get to the heart and intimate sense of our own culture and establish and establish a vivid continuity between the still living power of our past and the yet uncreated power of our future. So he's telling you this, there is a living power of that which is held in the Sanskrit language, and with that, if we can build this bridge, it will lead into the uncreated power of our future. Now, he's speaking of this because it was in the context primarily for India. But if you understand the root sounds and structure of Sanskrit are at the root of Latin, Greek and all the ancient tongues, including Hebrew and others, it is necessary for the world's future even in some way. Again, Sri Aurobindo says, the ancient and classical creations of the Sanskrit tongue, both in quality and in body and abundance of excellence, in their potent originality and force and beauty, in their substance and art and structure, in grandeur and justice and charm of speech, and in the height and width of the reach of their spirit, stand very evidently in the front rank among the world's great literatures. Now, when you have all these superlatives, it has to be demonstrated. Where is the evidence? And so this book becomes one of those, the wonder that is Sanskrit. But there's much more that can be done in this domain. Then Sri Aurobindo writes, the language itself, as has been universally recognized by those competent to form a judgment, is one of the most magnificent, the most perfect and wonderfully sufficient literary instruments developed by the human mind. At once majestic and sweet and flexible, strong and clearly formed, and full and vibrant and subtle. And its quality and character would be of itself a sufficient evidence of the character and quality of the race whose mind it expressed, and the culture of which it was the reflecting medium. So you understand why it is so important to recover this, because it also comes back to the originality of the consciousness and the mind, which is a template for the future perhaps. Must be recovered. What was at that time perhaps in an exceptional few who were leaders of humanity as rishis or great sages, now must become common among the mass of humanity if we are to move forward in evolution. Again, the mother speaks of this context of Sanskrit. She says, Sanskrit to be taught in the ashram school, to make it compulsory along with their mother tongue. Mother says yes, not Sanskrit from the point of view of scholarship, but Sanskrit that opens the door to all the languages of India. A rejuvenated Sanskrit as the representative language of India. That is a spoken Sanskrit behind all the languages. This was Sri Aurobindo's idea when we spoke about it. Because now English is the language of the whole country, but that is abnormal. It is very helpful for relations with the rest of the world. But just as each country has its own language, and then she speaks of how people want to quarrel when we speak of national language, each one wants his own language, etc. And then she says, this is something, no one should object to Sanskrit. It is a more ancient language than the others, and it contains the sounds, the root sounds of many words. This is something I studied with Sri Aurobindo, and it is obviously very interesting. Some of the roots can even be found in the languages of the world sounds, root sounds which are found in all those languages. Every child born in India should know it, just as every child born in France has to know French. You don't have to speak it perfectly, but you have to know it, she says. And then she says it will even bring unity within India. And so, but I hope that a day will come when it will be possible. I would like to have a simple Sanskrit taught, as simple as possible, but not simplified simple, by going back to its origin of the root sounds that are roots of the words which are formed afterwards. I don't know whether you have anyone here who could do that, she says. In fact, I don't know whether there is anyone in India who could do it. Sri Aurobindo knew. But someone who knows Sanskrit can. I don't know. So, well, I believe that we are at a point today where this is possible. There are very few people who have this, but a few people have it. And I believe this is work which needs to be done. I know Sampadananda personally, who is one who has gone deep into the roots, but this now has to spread. And I'm putting this forward to all of you. It does not matter whether you choose to learn Sanskrit or whether you choose to go into root sounds. Recognize this, recognize what this means. and then allow it to dawn into you. At least align yourself to the truth of this. And then mother's comment, 1965, interestingly. Someone asked, the language problem harasses India. Mother says, unity must be a living fact and not the imposition of an arbitrary rule. When India will be one, she will have spontaneously a language understood by all. And again she has another comment on Sanskrit with simple but not simplified. And this was the point we made earlier when we discussed some of the efforts being made currently in India. And I have mentioned also Sanskrit Bharati, which uses a structure which is very simplified. It's a very good start, but it is not going to the root sound structure, so it kind of misses the point. I wish that somebody could, or maybe they can structure themselves differently to turn in this direction, because they have a lot of capacity and outreach. They have done excellent work. But by simplifying, you're reducing, not returning to roots, which is simple, not simplified. So this is a challenge we still have to resolve. Then finally, there is one comment. I will read from this William Jones, which is one of the very interesting. He was a scholar, he was a British philologist, he was a judge in the Supreme Court of Bengal and a scholar of ancient India. So he had this, he was not a colonizer, he had empathy, because I believe these are people who were actually reincarnations of some of the Indian sages perhaps even. But he was an exceptional person. So he had particularly dwelt on this idea that Sanskrit linked all the languages of the world. So he writes, and I am quoting exactly now, the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer can examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit, and the old Persian might be added to the same family. So you see, in the same direction as what Sri Aurobindo later developed and gave the evidence for. But that's about it. I think with this we will take a pause on all that we have covered so far. There were a few questions we had intended for today, but we'll keep that for another time. Next time we will focus on the interaction we will have with Sampadananda Mishra, and some of the questions which are pending I will bring within that context. Those which are not suitable for that context we will cover after that, which will perhaps be the last session on this topic, and then we will move to a different theme. So I think let's take a moment to pause here, review what we have covered. I'm going to scroll through the chat box quickly. So someone asked, given that there have been editions in Savitri since 1950, which one should we follow? There is in fact the last edition that Sri Aurobindo personally corrected, which was published 2 months after he left his body. So that is the 1951 February edition or so, which later was reprinted, and I think currently it is printed with Savitri Foundation. That's the closest we have to what Sri Aurobindo himself did. There are a few changes from that even to the current edition in the collected works. I do not know the scope of that, but at least for many that's good enough. The centenary volume is not, because as I said there were about 500 corrections. Some of them simply errors made in copying, but sometimes there were improvements made by some proofreaders. So yes, there are some other interesting comments. Maital is asking, to set up a school in India to bring back our contribution, what can Indian Americans do? Get funds, spread the word. Yes, perhaps you can do all that. The point though, it's at the moment at least, it's not, doesn't seem like it can happen top down, because the top down institutions have been so powerfully hijacked that even if you try to, they will oppose and block it. So it seems like it will happen from a more grassroots awakening. But as for example here, so many of you asked, where can we learn? And unless there is some easy way through which you can start accessing and start learning casually perhaps, just allow the sounds to soak in and play with it. Sampadanand has been involved in a project, he's actually headed it, to create an app for teaching languages, particularly to teach Sanskrit. And so I just discovered that only yesterday, I didn't know about it. So we'll have him speak about it next week, and also what he plans to do in terms of courses. That will be a good start. For me, it's very important that we, from the beginning, root ourselves in the root sounds and grow inside out in learning Sanskrit. Of course, you can start learning verses, sacred verses, chants, dwell on the meaning as you chant. These are ways by which one internalizes any language. And that's it, I think. Let's take a moment then to concentrate, look back at the big picture of what we covered today, which justifies this whole exploration of this topic. The body of knowledge, a language itself that is able to articulate a spiritual experience and an intuitive experience and bring the full force and power in a manner which is at once powerful as well as supple and subtle. And we saw examples of how that can be. And then an entire repository of the civilizational aspiration and the soul of the nation held in this language, which has been cut off from its children. And yet it must inevitably come forward in some form or other. But it will happen by people waking up, and it starts with us, all of us. Wake up, become conscious of this, read a little bit, start learning a little bit. We'll share tools perhaps next time when we talk to Sampad. But read a little, start a little, dwell on Sri Aurobindo's writings, particularly in this way. You don't have to understand everything, you don't have to become a scholar, enjoy it. Don't worry if you forget, you don't have to be able to memorize and repeat what he taught you. As you read, you enjoy it, it fills you deeply, touches you deeply, that's nourishment for the soul. You may forget in the mind, but something deeply has moved. And that's how we will help bring back this power that is held in the civilizational past and the force that is present in the language. Inevitably, it will spread, and the future of the world even will be Sanskrit more and more. While keeping other languages, it will form like a link language because of its inherent capacity perhaps. Let's take a moment to concentrate in aspiration and in gratitude for Sri Aurobindo, who has given us all this, without which we would be completely lost.